Hello and welcome. Tonight we set sail on a dark and uncertain sea. Our journey takes us to the edge of the known world and into a vast, empty wilderness of water and sky. This is the story of one of the most famous voyages in history, but we will not be telling it from the captain's deck. We will be telling it from the perspective of the common sailor, the forgotten men whose grim endurance made it all possible. It is a story of hardship, of fear, and of survival against impossible odds. So find your comfort. Let the worries of your day drift away like a ship slipping its moorings. There is nothing required of you now. Simply close your eyes and listen. Our story begins in the port of Palos de la Frontera in the south of Spain during the sweltering, fly-blown summer of 1492. The air is thick with the smells of the harbor, the sharp, salty temps of the sea, the smell of hot tar, rotting fish, and the sweet, cloying scent of cheap wine spilling from the dockside taverns. It is a place of noise and desperation, a bustling hub of sailors, merchants, and men with nothing to their names but the ragged clothes on their backs. It is here that we find our young man, Pedro. Pedro is not a seasoned mariner. He is the third son of a poor farmer from the dusty hills beyond the town. He has never felt the deck of a ship roll beneath his feet, and the vast blue expanse of the Atlantic is a terrifying mystery to him. But he has also felt the gnawing ache of true hunger, and he has seen the despair in his family's eyes as another harvest fails. And so he finds himself here, drawn by the promise of a steady wage and a share of the unimaginable riches that the strange Genoese captain, Columbus, has promised to find across the sea. He does not truly believe the captain's stories of golden-roofed palaces in the land of Cathay, but he does believe in the silver coins he has promised upon his return, and for that he is willing to risk everything. He signs his name to the ship's roster with a crude, trembling mark. He is assigned to the Santa Clara, a small but sturdy caravel, better known by her nickname, the Nina, and it is here, as he steps aboard the vessel that will be his home, his workplace, and his prison for an unknowable amount of time, that the first wave of grim reality begins to wash over him. The first and most overwhelming shock is the size. A caravel like the Nina sounds grand in the abstract, but the reality is suffocatingly small. The ship is perhaps only 70 feet long and 20 feet wide. Into this tiny, floating wooden world, a crew of more than 20 men must fit. Along with all the provisions, the water barrels, the spare sails and ropes, and the cargo for trade. There is no such thing as personal space. Every inch of the ship is occupied, every surface cluttered. The main deck is a chaotic tangle of ropes, barrels, and equipment. The only shelter from the relentless sun or the driving rain is a small raised structure at the stern, the quarterdeck, which is the exclusive domain of the captain and the officers. For a common sailor like Pedro, there is no escape from the elements. He will work, eat, and sleep on these same open, crowded planks of wood, and there is no place to sleep. There are no bunks, no hammocks, no cabins for the crew. When a sailor is not on watch, he must find a place to collapse wherever he can. He might try to find a small space between two barrels, or curl up in a coil of rope, or simply lie down on the hard, wet deck, his head resting on his knees. Sleep is not a guarantee. It is a precious and fleeting commodity, snatched in brief, uncomfortable intervals. It's always subject to the rocking of the ship and the call to return to duty. As he is led below deck to stow his meager belongings, the second shock hits him: the smell. The lower deck, the hold, is a dark, stifling, and foul-smelling space. It is a cramped, low-ceilinged cavern filled to capacity with the ship's vital supplies. But the dominant smell is that of the bilge. The bilge is the lowest part of the ship, a space where all the filth of the voyage collects. It is an unavoidable consequence of a wooden ship's construction. The hull is never perfectly watertight, and a slow, constant seepage of seawater is inevitable. This water collects in the bilge, and it does not remain clean. It mixes with everything that spills or leaks from above: the grease from the cook's galley, the dregs of spilled wine, the urine and vomit of seasick sailors, and the filth from the rats that infest the ship. This stagnant, sloshing soup of foulness is the ship's ever-present cesspool, and its stench permeates everything. It is a thick, gag-inducing odor of rot, decay, and human waste. A smell that clings to the sailors' clothes, their hair, and even the food they eat. One of the most hated and feared jobs on the ship is working the pumps, a grueling, back-breaking task of pumping this vile water out of the ship and back into the sea. The bilge is the ship's dark, rotten secret, a constant stinking reminder of the decay that is an inseparable part of life at sea. And then there are the other inhabitants. The ship is a teeming, crawling ecosystem of pests. Cockroaches scuttle in the darkness, their antennae twitching. Lice are an unavoidable misery, infesting the sailors' clothes and hair, their bites leaving small, red, itching welts. But the true kings of the hold are the rats. They are everywhere, their sharp black eyes gleaming in the lantern light, their claws skittering across the wooden barrels. They are bold and fearless, and they contaminate the food stores, their droppings and urine fouling the precious grain and biscuits. They are a constant, unwelcome presence, a reminder that this small wooden world does not belong to the men alone. The work itself is the final piece of this brutal new reality. A sailing ship is a complex machine, and it demands constant, relentless labor to function. From the moment the sun rises to the moment it sets, and often through the night, the men are working. Pedro, being new to the sea, is assigned the most grueling and least skilled tasks. He hauls on the thick, stiff ropes, the coarse hemp fibers, rubbing his soft farmer's hands raw until they bleed. The blisters soon turn too hard, painful calluses. The work is brutally heavy, and it is made infinitely more dangerous by the constant violent motion of the ship. He is ordered to climb the rigging, to untie the sails high above the deck. He forces himself to ascend the rope ladder, his stomach churning with vertigo. The mast sways in a wild, sickening arc with every swell of the ocean. The wind whips at his clothes and tries to tear him from his precarious hold. Below him, the deck looks terrifyingly small, the sea a churning, indifferent expanse. A single misstep, a single slip of the hand, will mean a fall of 50 feet to the hard deck or the unforgiving water. A death sentence either way. There are no safety nets, no second chances. He learns to move with a slow, deliberate caution, his fear a cold, hard knot in his gut. The work never stops, and the sea is never, ever safe. This is his new life, a life of filth, of exhaustion, and of constant quiet terror. In a small wooden prison adrift on an endless hostile sea. The physical environment of the ship is a constant assault on the senses. but it is the rigid and brutal social structure that truly defines life as a prison. A caravel at sea is a tiny, floating dictatorship, an isolated world with its own absolute and unforgiving laws. Pedro learns this on his first day. There is an immense, uncrossable gulf between the officers and the common crew. The Captain General, Columbus, along with the ship's master and the pilot, are like gods in this small universe. They inhabit the relatively spacious cabin in the stern castle, a space forbidden to the common sailors. They eat a different, better quality of food, their salted meat, less rancid, their wine of a higher grade.
Oh.
They are exempt from all physical labor, their hands remaining soft while the crew's hands are torn to shreds by the ropes and the work. Their role is to command, and their commands are absolute law. Just below them are the petty officers, the enforcers of this iron-willed discipline. The most important of these is the boatswain, the contramaster. He is a veteran sailor, a man whose face and spirit seem to have been carved from the same salt-cured, hardened wood as the ship itself. He is the foreman, the taskmaster, and the dispenser of punishment. His primary tool of persuasion is the rope's end, a short, thick piece of heavy rope, knotted at the end, which he carries at his belt. His eyes miss nothing, and his temper is as unpredictable as the sea itself. Pedro, as a grummet, a ship's boy, is at the absolute bottom of this rigid hierarchy, is the last to eat and the first to be assigned the most unpleasant and dangerous tasks. He is the one ordered to climb to the highest point of the swaying mast in a rising wind, the one sent crawling into the stinking, rat-infested hold to fetch a barrel of supplies, and the one tasked with cleaning the foul messes on the deck. He is at the beck and call of every common seaman who in turn vents their own frustrations upon him. He learns to make himself as small and as unnoticeable as possible, to obey every order instantly and without question, because he quickly learns that any hesitation, any mistake, is met with immediate and brutal punishment. He witnesses this for the first time on the third day at sea. A sailor, clumsy from exhaustion, drops a wooden mallet, which clatters across the deck. The boatswain is on him in an instant. There is no warning, no reprimand. It's just a single, barked command to the other sailors to seize the man. The unfortunate sailor is tied to the main mast, his shirt ripped from his back. The boatswain takes out his rope's end and with a calm, practiced efficiency begins to flog the man. The sound is a sickening, wet thud, a sound that cuts through the normal noises of the ship. The sailor cries out at the first blow, a sharp, desperate sound, but he is silent after that, his body just shuddering with each impact. The rest of the crew is made to watch in silence. Their faces are grim, impassive masks, but Pedro can see the fear in their eyes. This is not just a punishment for one man. It is a lesson for them all. It is a clear and brutal demonstration of the ship's law. There is no room for error, no space for weakness, no recourse to mercy. There is only the order and the pain that follows any failure to execute it. The sailor is untied and stumbles away, his back a crisscrossed map of bleeding welts. No one helps him. No one speaks of it. The event is simply absorbed into the grim, silent reality of their lives. Pedro learns to move with a constant low-level fear, a knot in his stomach that never fully loosens. The complete and total lack of privacy is another form of torture. A man can find no moment of solitude, no space to be alone with his own thoughts. Every act, from eating to sleeping, is performed in the full view of the entire crew. Even the most basic and private of bodily functions is a public affair. The ship's toilet, known as the heads, is not a private room. It consists of a simple wooden plank with a hole in it, or sometimes just a net, suspended over the water at the very bow of the ship, in front of the forecastle. It is a space that is completely exposed to the wind, the sea spray, and the eyes of every other man on board. In rough seas, it is a terrifyingly dangerous place to be, with the waves crashing over the bow, threatening to tear a man from his precarious perch and cast him into the sea. It is a place of profound humiliation and vulnerability. Another daily reminder that on this ship, they are little more than animals in a wooden cage, but not engaged in the exhausting, dangerous work of sailing the ship. The other great enemy is the profound, soul-crushing boredom. After the first few days, once the coastline of Spain has disappeared behind them, the view from the ship becomes an unchanging, monotonous vista of water and sky. The routine of the ship is a cycle of the same handful of tasks performed over and over again. The sun rises, the work begins, the meager rations are handed out. The sun sets, and the long, dark watch of the night begins. Each day is an exact copy of the one before, a slow, grinding repetition that seems to stretch into an eternity. The men try to fill the long, empty hours of their off-watch time with whatever distractions they can find. They spend hours mending their ragged, salt-stiffened clothes, their needles rising and falling in a slow, meditative rhythm. They huddle in small groups, gambling with crude dice made from bone, their meager possessions changing hands over and over again. Sometimes they sing, but these are not the cheerful, adventurous shanties of later eras. They are slow, mournful, and fatalistic ballads, songs about lost loves, about the cruelty of the sea, and about the certainty of a lonely death far from home. The songs are a reflection of their own grim reality, a quiet, melancholic soundtrack to their slow, monotonous journey into the great, empty unknown. Pedro, who once loved the songs of the harvest, finds no comfort here, simply watches and listens, and feels the vast, empty loneliness of the sea seep into his very bones. For a boy like Pedro, whose life has been spent on the solid, unmoving earth of a farm, the most fundamental and immediate torture is the motion of the ship itself. For the first week, he is in a constant state of agonizing seasickness. The world refuses to hold still. The deck pitches and rolls in a relentless, chaotic rhythm, a constant assault on his sense of balance. A cold, clammy sweat perpetually coats his skin. His stomach is a tight, churning knot of nausea that never subsides. He retches over the side of the ship until there is nothing left in his belly but bitter green bile. The cruel irony is that his sickness provides no respite from his duties. He is still expected to haul ropes and swab the decks, his body weak and trembling, his movements clumsy and uncertain. The boatswain's only cure for seasickness is a sharp blow from the rope's end, accompanied by a roar to get back to work. Even after his body reluctantly adapts to the motion, the physical strain of simply existing on the ship is unending. The deck is never flat. The caravel is almost always heeled over, sailing with the wind, meaning that life is lived on a permanent shifting angle. Walking from one end of the ship to the other is a staggering, lurching exercise, a constant battle to maintain one's footing on the wet, slippery planks. Every task, from coiling a rope to carrying a bucket of water, is made exponentially more difficult by the need to brace oneself against the ship's unpredictable movements. The sailors' bodies are in a constant state of tension, their leg and core muscles perpetually engaged to counteract the rolling of the sea. They develop a characteristic wide-legged gait, a sailor's shuffle, but the strain is always there, a deep, grinding exhaustion that settles into their very bones. The ship itself is a minefield of everyday hazards. In the cramped chaos of the deck, danger is everywhere. A sudden, violent lurch of the vessel can send a poorly secured barrel of salted meat sliding across the deck with enough force to crush a man's leg. A heavy block from the rigging can fall from above without warning, a deadly projectile capable of splitting a skull. But the most common danger comes from the ropes. The thick hemp ropes that control the sails are under immense and constant tension. If a rope snaps, or if it is mishandled, it can whip across the deck with the speed and force of a striking snake, breaking bones or taking off a limb. Pedro learns to move with a new kind of awareness, a constant, fearful respect for the raw, mechanical power that surrounds him. Even a minor injury, an event that would be trivial on land, can become a death sentence in the foul, unsanitary environment of the ship. The wood of the deck is rough and unfinished, a constant source of splinters. Pedro sees a man pull a long, thin sliver of wood from his palm. Within 2 days, the small wound is red and swollen. By the 4th day, the man's hand is a puffy, grotesque parody of itself in red lines. The telltale tracks of a deep infection are beginning to snake up his arm. The ship has no doctor, only a barber surgeon whose only real tool is a saw. There is nothing to be done. The man develops a raging fever, his body shaking with chills in the sweltering heat. He becomes delirious, muttering the names of his wife and children. He dies on the 6th day, his body a fever-racked, stinking mess. He is unceremoniously wrapped in his own blanket, weighted down with a cannonball, and after a brief mumbled prayer from the captain, he is tipped over the side. The splash is small. The sea swallows him without a trace. He is the first to die, but Pedro knows, with a chilling certainty, that he will not be the last. Amidst this world of physical misery, a deeper psychological strain begins to grow. It is the strain of doubt. From his place on the main deck, Pedro often sees the Captain General, Columbus. The man is a remote and alien figure. He stands apart on his quarterdeck, surrounded by his officers, his gaze fixed on the western horizon, is constantly consulting his strange, complex charts, taking readings with his astrolabe and making notes in his journal. He speaks rarely to the common sailors, and when he does, it is with an air of absolute, almost messianic certainty. He speaks of the will of God, of the certainty of the riches of the Indies that lie just beyond the horizon. In the first week, his confidence is infectious. But as the 2nd week turns into the 3rd, and the 3rd into a month, with no change in the endless empty seascape, his certainty begins to look less like genius and more like madness. The sailors, simple, superstitious men, begin to whisper among themselves. They are far further west than any European ship has ever sailed. They are in a part of the ocean that is not on any known map. They are, in a very real sense, lost in a great blue wilderness. The old fears, the tavern tales of sea monsters and boiling waters begin to surface. Every floating mass of seaweed is mistaken for the back of a leviathan. Every strange cloud on the horizon is an omen of doom. They begin to watch their captain with a new suspicion. They see him as a foreigner, a Genoese dreamer, who is leading a crew of good Spanish sailors to their deaths for his own pride and ambition. The promises of gold and glory now seem like a cruel joke. What good is gold at the bottom of an endless sea? The mood on the ship begins to sour. to turn from a grim resignation into a quiet, simmering resentment. Pedro can feel it in the air, in the dark looks the men cast towards the quarterdeck, in the way they fall silent when an officer approaches. He's a boy, on the lowest rung of the ship's ladder, and he is caught in the middle of a slow, terrifying breakdown of order on a ship of fools led by a madman, sailing determinedly towards the edge of the known world. The wooden prison is not just a place of physical hardship. It is a crucible of psychological terror, and the walls are beginning to close in. The voyage pushes on, a slow, relentless crawl into an endless blue desert. The first month has passed, and the world has been reduced to the monotonous cycle of watch and work, of sun and stars, of the creaking wood and the sighing wind. The initial violent shocks of the sea, the brutal discipline, the vertigo of the rigging, the constant, nauseating motion have dulled into a grim, weary acceptance. But now, a new and more insidious enemy begins to emerge, a quiet, creeping horror that rises not from the sea or the sky, but from the very barrels that are meant to sustain them. This is the slow, inexorable decay of their food and water, the beginning of a long and desperate battle against starvation and sickness. The central pillar of a sailor's diet, the very foundation of his existence, is the ship's biscuit. It is known by many names: hardtack, sea bread, worm castles, and it is the source of a misery that is both profound and unending. Pedro learns this quickly. The biscuit is not bread as he knows it. There is no softness, no warmth, no comforting taste of the hearth. It is a simple, brutal object, a thick, square cracker made of nothing more than flour, water, and sometimes a little salt, baked 2, 3, or even 4 times until it is utterly devoid of moisture. The result is a substance that is less like food and more like a piece of building material. It is as hard as fired clay, as dense as wood, and almost impossible to bite into directly without risking a cracked tooth. The standard method of consumption is to break the biscuit into smaller pieces. By striking it against the deck or with the handle of a knife, and then to soak these hard, dry fragments in whatever liquid is available. Pedro learns to drop them into his daily ration of thin, sour wine, the pasca, and to wait for 10 or 15 minutes until they soften into a gritty, flavorless, and vaguely edible mush. This is his breakfast, his lunch, and his dinner. It is a meal that provides bulk and a small measure of sustenance, but no pleasure, no comfort, and precious little real nutrition. But the hardness of the biscuit is only its first challenge. The true horror lies within. The wooden barrels in which the biscuits are stored are not airtight, and the damp, warm hold of the ship is the perfect breeding ground for insects, as the biscuits are infested. When Pedro first breaks open a cracker, he is horrified to see the inside riddled with small, dark tunnels and the tiny, black, beetle-like forms of weevils. He sees their small, white larvae, like tiny, writhing maggots, nestled in the dusty flour. His first instinct is one of pure, revulsed disgust, and he throws the piece overboard. The boatswain sees this and rewards him with a sharp cuff to the side of the head. "Food is food, boy," he growls. "You'll be grateful for those worms soon enough," Pedro learns, as all the sailors do, to adapt. In the dim light of the hold or during the night watches, the men develop a grim ritual. They hold the biscuit over their tin cup and tap it sharply on the edge. This is the drummer's tattoo. In the quiet, you can hear the faint, dry patter of the weevils falling from the biscuit into the cup. When they are done, they simply blow the insects away and eat the biscuit in the dark, preferring not to see what they cannot remove. Pedro learns to do this, to eat in the dark, to ignore the faint, wriggling texture in his mouth. The bosun was right. As the weeks wear on and the true gnawing hunger begins to set in, he stops caring. The weevils and the maggots are just another form of meat, another small, desperate source of protein in a world of endless want. The other staple of their diet is the salted meat, primarily beef or pork, stored in massive wooden barrels and preserved in a thick, heavy brine. In the first weeks of the voyage, this is a welcome, savory addition to the blandness of the biscuit. But the barrels are not always perfectly sealed, and the preservation methods are crude. As time goes on, the quality of the meat begins to decay in horrifying ways. When a barrel is opened, the smell alone is a physical assault, a putrid, eye-watering stench of rancid fat and decaying flesh. The meat itself, when it is pulled from the foul-smelling brine, is a stringy, tough, and unappetizing sight. The color is often wrong, a sickly greenish or purplish tint covering the dark flesh. The fat is a slimy yellow substance that feels greasy and corrupt to the touch. It is so saturated with salt that it burns the mouth and tongue, and it creates a raging, unquenchable thirst that the meager water rations can never hope to satisfy. Their water is the final and perhaps most disgusting element of their slow decay. It is stored in wooden barrels, and in the hot, stagnant hold of the ship, it quickly becomes foul. The water develops a thick, slimy texture from the growth of algae, which coats the inside of the barrels in a green, viscous film. It takes on a nauseating, sulfurous smell like rotten eggs. It is often warm from the heat of the hold, and to drink it is to swallow a mouthful of warm, thick, stinking slime. The sailors try to make it palatable by straining it through a piece of cloth, a futile gesture that does nothing to improve the taste, but at least removes the larger pieces of floating scum. They learn to drink it with their eyes closed and their noses held, to swallow it as quickly as possible. The only thing that makes the water bearable is the addition of the sour wine, the posca. The sharp acidic taste of the wine helps to mask the foulness of the water, and the alcohol, however weak, helps to kill some of the teeming bacteria within it. This mixture of foul water and sour wine is their only source of hydration, a thin, acidic, an unrefreshing liquid that does little to quench the thirst created by the heavily salted meat. Pedro dreams of the cool, clear water from his family's well back home, a memory so pure and perfect that it feels like a fantasy. In the middle of an endless ocean, surrounded by more water than he could ever imagine, he is in a constant grinding state of thirst. This is the grim paradox of the sea, a lesson in the difference between water that is life and water that is death. The ship sails on, a lonely speck of wood on an infinite ocean. The days bleed into one another, each one a mirror of the last, a monotonous cycle of work, hunger, and fitful sleep. More than a month has passed since the crew has seen land, and the initial disgust Pedro felt for his rations has now been replaced by a far more primal and terrifying emotion: the gnawing fear of starvation. The supplies are finite, and the ocean is endless. Every day the ship's master, his face a grim, worried mask, doles out the rations with an increasingly sparing hand. The half biscuit that was once a meal is now a full day's portion. The sliver of salted meat is a rare treat reserved for every third day. The gnawing ache of hunger in Pedro's stomach is no longer a temporary discomfort. It has become his constant companion, a dull, ever-present pain that drains his strength and fogs his mind. The effects of this prolonged malnutrition begin to right themselves on the bodies of the crew. The men grow leaner, their faces becoming gaunt and hollow-cheeked, their eyes seeming to sink deeper into their skulls. Their movements, once driven by the nervous energy of the desperate, become slower, more deliberate, a conscious effort to conserve every precious scrap of energy. A profound lethargy settles over the ship, a weariness that goes deeper than the simple fatigue of hard labor. It is the weariness of bodies that are beginning to consume themselves. And it is in this fertile ground of hunger and exhaustion that the true scourge of the age of sail begins to plant its insidious seeds. It does not arrive like a storm, with a sudden violent fury. It comes as a whisper, a subtle, creeping malaise that the men at first dismiss as just another hardship of their miserable existence. It begins with a deep and unnatural tiredness, a feeling of being weighed down by an immense invisible burden. It is accompanied by a strange and profound melancholy, a black mood that settles over the crew, making them irritable, withdrawn, and prone to sudden fits of despair. The men's limbs begin to ache, their joints throbbing with a dull pain that they attribute to the damp sea air and the relentless work. No one yet knows what it is. No one understands that this is the quiet, unassuming arrival of a slow and agonizing death. This is the onset of scurvy. Pedro first notices the undeniable signs in an older sailor, a man named Tomas, who shares his watch. Tomas begins to complain that his legs feel weak and heavy, and Pedro sees strange dark spots appearing on the man's shins, like deep, ugly bruises, though the man has not injured himself. Then, one morning, Tomas smiles a grim, humorless smile, and Pedro is horrified by what he sees. The man's gums, once healthy and pink, are now swollen and puffy, a dark purplish-black color, and they seem to have grown down over his teeth. A thin trickle of blood runs from the corner of his mouth. Within a week, this horrifying affliction has spread through more than half the crew. The ship has become a floating infirmary of the dying. The sight of the men's mouths is a vision from a nightmare. Their gums are black and necrotic, bleeding freely and emitting a foul, putrid odor of decay that is noticeable from several feet away. The very structure of their jaws begins to fail, the connective tissues that anchor the teeth dissolving from within. Their teeth, with nothing left to hold them, become loose. The men can wiggle them with their tongues. Soon, they begin to fall out, often without pain, simply dropping from the rotting gums as a man tries to chew his hard biscuit, or sometimes being pulled out with the fingers, as one might pull a loose pebble from the mud. The disease continues its relentless, systematic deconstruction of the human body. The dark, bruise-like spots on the skin grow larger and more numerous, merging into great black patches that cover the legs and arms. The skin becomes dry, rough, and scaly. But perhaps the most bizarre and terrifying symptom is the reopening of old wounds, a long-healed scar on one man's arm. The result of a knife fight years ago begins to ache. It then swells, turns a dark, angry red, and, over the course of a few days, the scar tissue seems to dissolve, the wound pulling itself open as if it were fresh. The raw flesh beneath, exposed to the salt air. It is as if the body has forgotten how to heal itself, as if its very history is being unwritten by this mysterious and merciless plague. The final stages are a slow descent into an agonizing and helpless invalidity. The men's joints, their ankles, their knees, their elbows swell to a grotesque size, the limbs becoming stiff and unbendable. The slightest movement sends waves of excruciating pain through their bodies. They lose all strength, their muscles wasting away until they are little more than skeletons draped in skin. They cannot work. They cannot walk. They cannot even stand. They are confined to their miserable, filthy sleeping spaces on the deck. Lying in their own waste, their bodies slowly, inexorably falling apart. For Pedro, who has so far been spared the worst of the symptoms, the psychological toll of watching his crewmates decay is almost as terrible as the disease itself. He lives in a world of constant, inescapable suffering. The air is filled with the low groans of men in pain and the foul stench of their rotting mouths. He sees his friends, men who were strong and vital just a few weeks before, reduced to helpless skeletal figures, their minds often wandering in a delirious fever. They do not know what is causing this plague, and they do not know how to stop it. They pray to their saints, but the disease does not listen to prayers. It is a slow, methodical, and impartial killer, and as Pedro looks at the gaunt, suffering faces around him, he cannot help but wonder when his own gums will begin to bleed, when his own teeth will begin to loosen, and when his own body will begin its slow, inexorable march towards a lonely death on this small, forgotten ship in the middle of a great, indifferent sea. The slow, methodical horror of scurvy is the most dramatic plague upon the ship, but it is by no means a solitary one. The same conditions that allow scurvy to flourish, the lack of fresh food and the crushing malnutrition, also render the crew as bodies fatally vulnerable to a host of other ailments. The foul, stagnant water and the poorly preserved, often contaminated food are a breeding ground for diseases of the gut. Soon, a new misery begins to spread through the ship, a sickness known to the sailors as the bloody flux. It is dysentery. It begins with agonizing stomach cramps that double a man over, followed by a debilitating and endless diarrhea that drains the body of its fluids and its strength. In the cramped, filthy conditions of the ship, with no sanitation and no way to isolate the sick, the disease spreads with a terrifying speed. The deck becomes a foul and dangerous place, and the already overwhelming stench of the bilge is now joined by the even more wretched smell of sickness and human waste. For men already weakened by hunger and scurvy, the bloody flux is often a death sentence. It leaves them hopelessly dehydrated and weak, their bodies unable to absorb what little nutrition they consume. Pedro watches in horror as strong men are reduced to frail, skeletal figures in a matter of days, their lives draining away from them in a constant, humiliating stream. As if this were not enough, other fevers also stalk the fetid, close quarters of the hold. Typhoid, a disease born of filth, makes its appearance. Men begin to burn with a high, unrelenting fever, their skin hot and dry to the touch. They become delirious, their eyes wide and unseeing, muttering nonsense or crying out to their mothers in their native tongues. A faint rash of rose-colored spots appears on their chests and abdomens, a sure sign of the disease that is consuming them from within. The ship has no doctor, no one who understands the nature of these illnesses. There is only a barber surgeon, a man whose medical knowledge is based on the ancient and tragically incorrect theory of the four humors. His treatments are not only useless, they are often actively harmful. The standard cure for any fever is bloodletting. The barber surgeon, his face grim with a sense of solemn purpose, will take out his lancet and open a vein in the sick man's arm, letting the bad blood and the excess humors drain out into a small bowl. For a man already suffering from dehydration and severe malnutrition, this practice of draining his lifeblood is the final push towards the grave. It further weakens an already failing body, hastening the inevitable end. The other treatments are a litany of folk remedies and prayers. The ship's priest moves among the sick and the dying, holding a crucifix to their lips, offering the final rites of the church. The sailors cling to lucky charms, 2 scraps of saints' relics, to any small token of superstition that might ward off the invisible poisons in the air and in their own bodies. The ship is no longer a vessel of exploration. It has become a charnel house, a floating pestilence. The air itself is thick with the smell of sickness and approaching death. The decks are slick with filth. The low, constant groaning of men in pain is the new, grim soundtrack to the voyage. A sound that is even more unnerving than the creaking of the ship's timbers. The few who are still healthy enough to work are forced to navigate this landscape of suffering. They must step over the bodies of their sick and dying crewmates, trying not to breathe too deeply, trying not to look too closely at the faces of men who were their friends just a month ago. Pedro is one of the fortunate few who has, so far, avoided the worst of the diseases, though he is by no means healthy. The hunger is a constant physical presence, a hollow ache in his core. His own joints have begun to ache with the first twinges of scurvy, and he feels a deep, unnatural weariness in his bones. Every morning, he wakes with a sense of dread. The first thing he does is run his tongue over his gums, a terrified secret ritual to check if they are still firm, to see if they have begun to bleed. He's living on a knife's edge, acutely aware that the same fate that has claimed so many of his shipmates is waiting for him, a patient and methodical predator. The work of sailing the ship must continue, but now it is performed by a ghost crew. There are barely enough able-bodied men left to manage the sails, to steer the ship, to work the pumps. The watches are longer, the work harder, the exhaustion deeper. The ship becomes sluggish, its movements less precise, its sails not trimmed as they should be. It is a vessel that is not just filled with dying men. The ship itself is slowly beginning to die, a reflection of the slow decay of the crew within it. The dream of gold and glory is a distant, mocking fantasy. The new goal, the only goal, is simply to survive the next hour, the next day. The men have been worn down by the brutal realities of their wooden prison, and now their own bodies have turned against them, rotting from the inside out in a slow, agonizing process of decay. They are trapped in a world of suffering, a place where the only escape is the final welcome release of death. The ship, a vessel of ghosts crewed by the sick and the dying, pushes ever westward. It has now been at sea for so long that the world they left behind, the world of solid ground, of trees, of villages and familiar faces, feels like a distant, half-forgotten dream. The physical miseries of their existence, the gnawing hunger, the foul water, the constant, low-grade pain of their decaying bodies have become the baseline of their reality, a state so constant that it is almost unremarkable. But as their bodies are worn down to their absolute limits, their minds begin to fray. A new and perhaps even more terrifying enemy begins to assert its dominion, the profound, soul-crushing horror of the unknown. Their world has been reduced to a perfect, unchanging circle of water and sky. Every morning, the sun rises from an empty eastern horizon, travels across a vast, featureless blue dome, and sinks into an empty western horizon. At night, the moon and the same cold, indifferent stars follow the same predictable path. There are no landmarks, there are no other ships, there are no familiar seabirds. There is nothing to mark their progress, nothing to suggest that they are moving towards a destination rather than simply sitting, becalmed in the dead center of a boundless, watery purgatory. This absolute monotony is a form of sensory deprivation, and it begins to work on the minds of the crew like a slow, corrosive poison. The men spend their long, empty hours on watch staring into the void, their eyes raw from the sun and the salt spray. They are desperate for a sign, any sign of change. A cloud formation that is different from the one the day before. A piece of floating driftwood, a bird that is not a seabird. Any small anomaly would be a lifeline of hope. A suggestion that the world is not, in fact, an endless, featureless void. But the signs do not come. The horizon remains stubbornly, terrifyingly empty, and with each new empty dawn, the fragile flame of hope in Pedro's heart flickers and burns a little lower. The mind begins to project its own fears, populating the emptiness with the dark superstitions of the age. These men are on the very edge of the known world, sailing into a part of the ocean that is marked on their maps with the simple, terrifying words, "Here be monsters." And they believe it. They believe it with every fiber of their being. They are prepared to face the dangers of storms and pirates. But they are not prepared for the creatures that are said to inhabit this sea of darkness. Every shadow on the water, every strange shape in the waves becomes a potential threat. A large mass of floating sargassum seaweed, a strange and unsettling sight in itself, is mistaken for the back of a sleeping leviathan. The great sea serpent from the Bible, large enough to swallow their ship whole. A pod of migrating whales, their dark backs rising and falling in the distance. Becomes a procession of sea monsters, their intentions unknown and surely malevolent. Pedro finds himself staring at the waves for hours, his imagination turning the natural play of light and shadow into the coiled tentacles of a kraken, waiting to rise from the depths and drag their small, fragile ship down into the abyss. They fear not only what lies beneath the water, but the water itself. The old tales and the scholarly maps all warn that far to the south. The ocean grows hot until it begins to boil, a place where the sea itself is a fiery trap. And they believe with a chilling certainty that if they sail too far west, they will simply fall off the edge of the world. They imagine the ocean pouring over a great cosmic waterfall into a void of darkness and chaos, a place from which there is no return. Every day that they push further into the unknown is another day they expect to feel the ship begin to slide, to hear the roar of the great waterfall. It is a constant low-level, existential terror. In this state of heightened fear, everything becomes an omen. A seabird that circles the mast 3 times is a sign of a coming storm. A shooting star is a portent of a death on board. The color of the sunset is scrutinized each evening, its shades of red and orange red like a prophecy of the next day's fortunes. The men whisper to each other about their dreams, searching for hidden meanings, for any clue about their fate. They have left the world of rational, predictable things behind, and have entered a world of magic, of monsters, and of omens. A world where their lives are at the mercy of vast, unseen, and unknowable forces. Time itself begins to dissolve. With no new events to mark its passage, the days and nights begin to blur into one another. An undifferentiated and seemingly endless continuum of misery. Pedro loses track of the date. Has it been 5 weeks since they left Palos? 6? 7? He cannot be sure. Passage of time is measured only by the slow, agonizing progression of the sickness among the crew, and the gradual, terrifying depletion of the food and water barrels. They are trapped in a timeless, featureless nightmare, and the sense of hopelessness is becoming a palpable presence on the ship, as thick and as suffocating as the foul air in the hold. The men fall into long, silent depressions, staring at nothing for hours, their faces empty masks of despair. The ship is no longer just a physical prison, it has become a psychological one, and its inmates are slowly, inexorably beginning to lose their minds. After more than 2 months at sea, a profound and dangerous change begins to occur in the collective spirit of the crew. The deep lethargic despair that has held them in its grip for weeks begins to burn away, replaced by a new, more volatile, and far more dangerous emotion, a slow-burning, desperate anger. The abstract fears of sea monsters and a boiling ocean have been overshadowed by a more immediate and tangible enemy. A single, solitary figure who paces the quarterdeck above them, his gaze fixed on the empty western horizon. Their fear and despair have finally found a target, the Captain General Christopher Columbus. The whispers begin in the darkest corners of the ship during the long, lonely hours of the midnight watch. They start in the foul-smelling hold among the rotting barrels and the scurrying rats. At first, they are just the quiet, desperate grumblings of exhausted men. "He is leading us to our deaths," one sailor might murmur to another. "There is no Cathay. There is nothing but this endless water." But as the days continue to pass, each one identical to the last, the whispers grow bolder, more urgent. Pedro hears them everywhere now. He hears the older, more experienced sailors, the men from Palos and Huelva, speaking in low, urgent tones. Their arguments are born of a desperate, practical logic. "We have been at sea for 60 days, one says, his voice a harsh rasp. "The winds that have brought us here will never allow us to return. We are doomed." Another sailor, his face a gaunt mask of hunger and sickness, adds his own fear. He is not even Spanish. He is a Genoese charlatan, a dreamer who will sacrifice all our lives for the sake of his strange maps and his mad ambition. The word spread from man to man, a quiet poison seeping through the ship's timbers. A single, terrifying idea begins to take root and grow. Mutiny. The word itself is never spoken aloud, not at first, but the meaning is clear in the dark looks the men cast towards the quarterdeck, in the way they form small, tight knots of conversation that immediately fall silent when an officer approaches. "If you will not turn the ship around," a sailor whispers, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife, "then we must turn it around ourselves." For Pedro, this new development is perhaps the most terrifying yet. He is trapped between two impossible fears. He is afraid of the endless ocean ahead, but he is now also afraid of his own crewmates. The shared misery that once bound them together is beginning to fracture, replaced by a tense and dangerous factionalism. He sees the crew dividing into groups, the captain's loyal officers, a handful of men who still cling to the promise of gold, and the growing majority who are consumed by a desperate desire to turn back to return to the world they know. The ship is no longer a simple prison. It has become a powder keg, and Pedro is a helpless child trapped inside it, waiting for the spark. The tension becomes a palpable presence on the ship, as thick and as suffocating as the fog. The discipline that once governed their lives with an iron fist begins to fray at the edges. The bosun's rope's end is used more frequently, but the beatings no longer inspire the same cowed obedience. They now fuel a sullen, silent resentment. The men work with a grim reluctance, their movements slow and resentful. Their eyes, when they look at the officers, are no longer just fearful. They are filled with a cold, hard hatred. The breaking point comes on a hot, windless afternoon. The sails hang limp from the masts. The ship bobs listlessly on a glassy, indifferent sea. The progress has slowed to a crawl, and the patience of the crew has finally snapped. A group of the most senior sailors, led by the ship's master himself, Juan de la Cosa, and the captain of the Pinta, Alonso, march in a grim procession to the quarterdeck. They are not armed, but their faces are set with a hard, desperate resolve. They have come to confront their leader. Pedro watches from the main deck below, his heart pounding in his chest. He cannot hear the words being exchanged on the quarterdeck, but he can see the scene play out in a tense, silent pantomime. He sees the angry, desperate gestures of his finger jabbing at the empty western horizon. He sees the grim, unified faces of the other sailors. Their arms crossed, their posture a clear and defiant challenge to the captain's authority, and he sees Columbus. The Captain General stands alone, facing them all. He does not shout, does not draw a sword. He simply stands there, his expression a mask of unshakable, almost infuriating confidence. He listens to their arguments, their pleas, their threats, and when they are done, he speaks. Pedro cannot hear his words, but he can see their effect. He sees Columbus raise his hand and point to the west, his gesture not one of debate, but of absolute, unshakable faith. It is the gesture of a man who believes he is an instrument of God's will, a man who cannot and will not be swayed by the fears of mortal men. For a long, terrifying moment, no one moves. The fate of the entire voyage hangs in the balance, suspended in the hot, still air. Pedro feels that this is the moment that violence will erupt, that the crew will seize their captain and turn the ship for home, leaving his mad dream to die in this empty ocean. But then Columbus makes a bargain. The details of it will filter down through the crew later, but the result is immediate. The tense, angry posture of the sailors on the quarterdeck begins to soften. There is a final exchange of words, a reluctant nod. From the confrontation is over. The sailors turn and descend back to the main deck, their faces still grim, but their open defiance gone, replaced by a sullen, reluctant compliance. The bargain, Pedro learns, is this. Columbus has asked for 3 more days. He has sworn a solemn oath that if they do not find land in 3 more days, he will abandon his quest and turn the ships for home. It is a fragile and desperate truce, a final gamble. The crew has agreed, but the trust is shattered, the unity of the voyage broken. They return to their duties, but now they are counting down the hours. Every man on the ship is now bound by this new, desperate timeline. 3 more days to find a new world, or 3 more days until they begin their long and likely fatal journey home. The psychological pressure on the ship has reached its absolute unbearable peak. The 3-day truce begins, and a new and even more intense psychological torture descends upon the ship. It is the tyranny of the deadline. The crew is no longer drifting in a timeless void. They are now prisoners of a frantic, desperate countdown. The first day passes in a state of tense, almost silent vigilance. The normal routines of the ship are carried out, but with a mechanical, joyless efficiency. Every man who is not actively working is standing at the rail, his eyes fixed on the western horizon, a silent, desperate prayer on his lips. The sun crawls across the empty sky with an agonizing slowness. Each hour that passes, feeling like a small death, another nail in the coffin of their hopes. The ocean, as if sensing their desperation, begins to play cruel tricks on their minds. A long, low-lying bank of dark clouds on the horizon is mistaken for a coastline. A frantic cry goes up, and for a few electrifying moments, the ship is consumed by a surge of hysterical hope, the men shouting, pointing, and embracing. But as they sail closer, the land dissolves into vapor, a cruel mirage. The hope collapses, leaving behind a despair that is even deeper and more bitter than before. The silence that follows is heavy and sullen, the silence of men who feel they have been personally mocked by the gods. Columbus himself seems to feel the immense pressure. He paces the quarterdeck more animated than Pedro has ever seen him, points to any small sign, no matter how insignificant, as proof that they are close. He points to a floating piece of seaweed, claiming it is a type that only grows near riverbanks. He points to a small bird, a petrel, and swears that such birds never venture more than a few leagues from shore. The men listen, but their faces are masks of doubt and suspicion. They have been sustained by the captain's promises for too long, and their faith is all but gone. The second day dawns, empty and mocking. But then, in the afternoon, something changes. A sailor points to the water, his voice a hoarse, disbelieving croak. Floating in the gentle swell is a branch, a simple piece of wood. But it is green, and it is covered in small fresh leaves and what look like tiny wild roses. A profound, stunned silence falls over the ship. This is not a cloud. This is not a sailor's fantasy. This is real. This is an object that could only have come from land, and it has been in the water for only a short time. Fragile, cautious, and almost painful hope begins to bloom in Pedro's chest. For the first time in weeks, the idea of land is not an abstract dream, but a tangible possibility. Later that afternoon, they see another sign, and then another. They pull a carved stick from the water, clearly shaped by a human hand. Though with a tool that is not iron, they see a flock of small, chattering birds, the kind that live in trees and fields. Flying purposefully towards the southwest, the mood on the ship transforms. Sullen despair is burned away, replaced by a feverish, almost frantic excitement. The men who were on the verge of mutiny are now scrambling up the rigging, each one desperate to be the first to claim the lifetime pension promised by the Spanish crown to the man who first sights land. The third and final day passes, and as the sun sets, casting a brilliant, blood-red glow across the western sky, no land has yet appeared. But the tension is no longer one of despair, but of unbearable anticipation. Columbus, sensing they are incredibly close, orders the ships to sail on through the night. No one even thinks of sleeping. Every man is on deck, every eye straining into the darkness, searching for a sign. Late in the night, Columbus himself calls out, He has seen a light, he claims, a faint flickering light on the horizon, like a small wax candle rising and falling. He calls a few of his officers to the quarterdeck. They stare into the darkness. One thinks he sees it, the others are unsure. Then it is gone. Was it a fire on a distant shore? A trick of the moonlight? Or just another phantom of their exhausted, desperate minds? The mystery hangs in the air, stretching their nerves to the breaking point. The hours crawl by. The moon is high and bright in the sky, illuminating a silver empty sea. The ship creaks and groans, a familiar lonely sound. And then, at 2 hours past midnight, a cry shatters the silence. It comes from high above, from the crow's nest of the Pinta, which is sailing ahead. It is the voice of the lookout, a sailor named Rodrigo de Triana, and his voice is a raw, ragged, triumphant scream of pure, unadulterated relief. Tiara, tiara. For a moment, there is a stunned silence as every man on board strains his eyes towards the west, and then they see it. In the silvery moonlight, miles ahead, is a faint, pale line on the horizon. It is not a cloud. It is a white sand beach, gleaming softly in the night. It is land. The reaction is an explosion of pure, cathartic emotion. The years of hardship, the months of terror, the weeks of despair, all of it comes pouring out in a single, overwhelming wave. Men who were once ready to kill each other are now embracing, tears streaming down their gaunt, weathered faces. Others fall to their knees on the deck, their bodies shaking with sobs of relief, offering loud, desperate prayers of thanks to God. Some are simply laughing, a wild, hysterical sound that is half joy and half madness. The psychological torment is over. They have not sailed off the edge of the world. They have not been led to their deaths by a madman. They are alive. They have survived. The great empty void of the ocean has an end, and they have found it. Ship, which was once a wooden prison, has now, in an instant, become a vessel of triumph, its crew waiting in a state of ecstatic, sleepless anticipation for the sun to rise on a new world. The dawn that breaks on the morning of October 12th, 1492, is the most beautiful that Pedro has ever seen. As the sun rises, it illuminates the island that had been a dark, mysterious shape in the night, and it is a vision of paradise. After months of staring at an empty two-tone world of blue water and white sky, the sight of land is an overwhelming, almost painful, sensory assault. The first thing that strikes him is the color green. It is a shade of green, so vibrant and so intense that it almost hurts his eyes. It is the deep, lush, and living green of a dense, unfamiliar forest that seems to grow right down to the water's edge. As they sail closer, new sensations flood over the ship, washing away the stale stench of the long voyage. A gentle breeze carries the scent of the island, a rich, complex perfume of damp earth, strange sweet-smelling flowers, and of wood smoke. Then comes the sound. It is a cacophony of life, a chorus of strange bird calls, the chirping of insects, and the gentle rhythmic sigh of small waves breaking on a white sand beach. For the men who have lived for months in a world of near-total sensory deprivation, this is an intoxicating and overwhelming experience. It is the smell and the sound of life itself. The longboats are lowered, and Pedro is among the men chosen to row the captain ashore. As he pulls on the oars, he cannot take his eyes off the island. He sees the tall, strange trees, the likes of which he has never seen in Spain. He sees the impossibly white sand of the beach, and the crystal clear turquoise water. The relief and the wonder are so profound that it feels like a religious experience. They have not just found land, they have found Eden. Columbus is the first to step ashore, dressed in his finest scarlet tunic, holding the royal standard of Spain. He falls to his knees and kisses the sand, offering a loud and theatrical prayer of thanks to God. The other captains follow, and they plant their own banners, formally claiming this new land for their distant king and queen. Pedro and the other sailors simply stand by, their feet sinking into the soft, warm sand, the feeling of solid, unmoving ground beneath them, a strange and wonderful sensation. They are weak, gaunt, and ravaged by scurvy, but they are alive, and they are standing in paradise. Their quiet, awestruck reverence is soon interrupted. Figures begin to emerge from the line of trees, moving with a quiet, cautious curiosity. They are the inhabitants of this island, the people. To Pedro, they are as alien and as wondrous as the island itself. They are a handsome, well-built people with olive-brown skin, and they are almost entirely naked. Their bodies are decorated with black and red paint, in patterns of lines and circles. Their black hair is cut short, except for a long section at the back. They carry no iron weapons, only simple wooden spears tipped with fishbone. They approach the Spanish sailors with a timid, childlike curiosity, their dark, gentle eyes wide with wonder at these strange, bearded men who have arrived from the sea in their great winged canoes. The first contact is peaceful. Columbus, with a grand, benevolent smile, offers them gifts. He gives them the cheap trinkets he has brought for trade. Small brass hawk S-bells that tinkle musically, strings of colorful glass beads, and red caps. The people are delighted by these simple objects, treating them as if they were treasures from the heavens. In return, they offer their own gifts. They bring the sailors parrots with brilliant green and red feathers, balls of spun cotton, and, most significantly, a few small, crudely made ornaments of gold, which they wear in their noses. Soon as Columbus sees the gold, a new, sharp, and feverish light enters his eyes. His benevolent smile becomes more focused, more intense. He uses gestures to ask where more of this yellow metal can be found. Not understanding the profound and dangerous obsession that is driving these strange visitors, simply point vaguely towards the south. For Columbus, this is all the confirmation he needs. He has not only found the Indies, he has found its gold. For Pedro, however, watching this exchange, a small, cold knot of unease begins to form in his stomach. He looks at the gentle, smiling faces of the natives, and he sees the hungry, avaricious look in his captain's eyes. He senses that this is not a meeting of two worlds, but the beginning of a conquest. The immediate concern for the crew, however, is not gold, but food. They are starving, and the island is a banquet. The natives share their food freely. Strange, sweet fruits like pineapple, roasted yams, and fish cooked over open fires. The sailors, who have dreamed of fresh food for months, fall upon it with a desperate, ravenous hunger. They gorge themselves, stuffing their shrunken, aching stomachs with more food than they have seen in months. But this paradise has a cruel and immediate sting in its tail. Their bodies, ravaged by malnutrition and accustomed only to the grim diet of hard biscuit and salted meat, are completely unprepared for this sudden onslaught of rich, strange food. Within hours, a new wave of sickness sweeps through the crew. The men are gripped by severe stomach cramps, by vomiting, and by a debilitating diarrhea. Their brief, joyous relief is replaced by a new kind of misery. Their bodies racked with pain as they struggle to digest the very paradise they had so desperately craved. And the island reveals other dangers. The warm, humid air, so pleasant at first, is thick with biting insects that they have never encountered before. Mosquitoes and tiny unseen sandflies descend upon them in clouds, their bites leaving the men's exposed skin covered in red, itching, and painful welts. The beautiful, exotic plants can be poisonous. The sweet-smelling water of the streams can carry strange, unfamiliar sicknesses. They have escaped the prison of the sea, but they have landed in a beautiful alien world that is not their own. A world whose hidden dangers they are only just beginning to understand. The dream of paradise is already beginning to fade, replaced by a new and far more complex reality. The initial overwhelming euphoria of landfall is a fleeting thing. For the common sailors like Pedro, the dream is simple: to feel solid ground, to eat fresh food, and to rest their weary, scurvy-ridden bodies. But for Christopher Columbus, this new world is not a place of rest. It is a puzzle to be solved, a treasure chest to be unlocked. And the only key he is interested in is gold. The small, simple gold ornaments worn by the gentle people are to him. A whisper of the vast gold mines and treasure-filled cities he is certain lie just beyond the horizon. And so, after only a few days, the order is given. The crew is to return to the ships. Their brief sojourn in paradise is over. Desperate, obsessive search for gold has begun. Columbus, against their will, takes several of the people captive, forcing them onto the ships to act as guides. So begins a grueling month-long journey of island hopping, frantic and increasingly desperate search for a prize that remains stubbornly out of reach. For Pedro, this new phase of the voyage is a different kind of misery. The work is relentless. Day after day, he is ordered into the longboat to row for hours under the blistering tropical sun, exploring the coastlines of new islands. The heat is a heavy, suffocating blanket, and the humidity is so high that his clothes are perpetually soaked with sweat. At night, they sleep in miserable, makeshift camps on shore, their sleep constantly interrupted by the strange, unsettling sounds of the jungle and the torment of biting insects. With each new island, the ritual is the same. They are met by the same gentle, curious people who greet them with gifts and food. And with each new landing, Columbus, through his captive interpreters, asks the same frantic question: where is the gold? The natives, who value the soft yellow metal only for ornamentation and have little of it, can only point vaguely towards other islands, a gesture that Columbus interprets as a clue, promise that the great prize is just a little further on. A dark and ugly change begins to take root among the Spanish crew. The initial awe and wonder they felt for the people quickly sours into a hardened, casual contempt. They begin to see the natives' generosity not as a virtue, but as a sign of foolishness and simplicity. They see their lack of clothing, their simple wooden weapons, and their unfamiliar customs as proof that they are not just different, but inferior, a subhuman race of savages given to them by God to command. This change in attitude quickly leads to acts of casual cruelty and exploitation. Pedro watches with a growing sense of shame and fear as his crewmates, men who were once his comrades in shared misery, transform into bullies and thieves. He sees a sailor tear a small gold plug from a woman's nose, laughing at her cry of pain. He sees the officers begin to demand food from the villagers, no longer waiting for it to be offered as a gift. The peaceful, cautious curiosity of the first encounter is replaced by a relationship of fear and intimidation. The Spanish have brought the old world's greed and violence with them, and it is already beginning to poison this new paradise. The voyage continues in this grim fashion for weeks, a monotonous cycle of sailing, landing, and disappointment. Then, on Christmas Eve, disaster strikes. The small fleet is sailing along the coast of a large island that Columbus has named Hispaniola. The sea is calm, the night is clear. Columbus, feeling the day is auspicious, retires to his cabin. The ship's master, in a fatal lapse of judgment, also decides to rest, leaving the tiller in the hands of an inexperienced ship's boy, an act that is strictly forbidden by the rules of the sea. Pedro is dozing on the deck when he feels it, a soft grinding shudder that runs through the entire length of the ship. It is not the violent crash of a ship hitting rocks, but a slow, gentle, and horrifying scraping sound. Santa, the flagship of the expedition, has run aground on a sandbank. The boy at the tiller, lulled by the calm sea, had not noticed the change in the currents. The ship is stuck fast. The night erupts into a chaos of shouted orders and frantic, useless activity. Columbus rushes onto the deck, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. He orders the mainmast to be cut down with axes, hoping to lighten the ship enough for it to float free. The sound of the great mast, the ship's very spine, cracking and then crashing into the sea, is a sound of finality, a sound of doom. But it is no use. The tide is falling, and the ship is only settling more firmly onto the reef. Soon, the seams of the hull begin to split, and the cold seawater begins to pour into the hold. The Santa is lost. The crew abandoned ship in a state of panicked disarray, their only thought to save themselves and the most valuable of the supplies. Their salvation comes from an unexpected source. The local chief, a man named, sees their plight and sends his entire village out in their long, graceful canoes to help. They work through the night, making countless trips back and forth, helping the Spanish sailors unload barrels of wine, chests of supplies, and even the ship's cannons, treating the property of these strange, violent visitors with a profound and gentle respect. By morning, the crew of the Santa is safe on the beach, surrounded by the salvaged remains of their ship, but their safety is also a trap. The flagship is gone. There are now 90 men and only 2 small caravels, the Nina and the Pinta, for the long journey home. There is not enough room and not enough food for them all to return. Columbus makes a decision born of this desperate new reality. Some of the men will have to stay behind. He declares that the shipwreck was not a disaster, but a sign from God, a providential signal that they are meant to build a settlement here. Using the timbers from the wrecked Santa, he orders the crew to build a crude fort, which he names La Navidad. In honor of the Christmas day on which the wreck occurred, he then selects 13 men to remain behind. It is not presented as a punishment, but as an honor, a chance to be the first colonists of this new world. With the task of gathering gold until Columbus returns on his next voyage, but every man there, including Pedro, knows the truth. It is not an honor. It is a death sentence. The men who are chosen are being abandoned. They're being left in a strange, alien world with dwindling supplies, surrounded by a people whose kindness they have already begun to repay with cruelty. as Pedro watches the fort being built and sees the terror and despair in the eyes of the men who have been condemned to stay. He understands that the true cost of this voyage is only just beginning to be calculated. The departure from La Navidad is a grim and somber affair. There are no triumphant fanfares, no cheerful farewells. There is only the quiet, desperate exchange of last words between the men who are leaving and the 39 who are condemned to stay. They are brothers, men who have survived the same hellish voyage, and now they are being torn apart. As Pedro looks at the faces of the men standing on the shore watching the longboats pull away, he sees a stark and terrible fear in their eyes. They are being left behind, a tiny, forgotten outpost of Europe in a vast, unknown, and potentially hostile world. It is a farewell that feels like a funeral. Pedro finds a place on the already crowded deck of the Nina. The small caravel designed for a crew of 20 is now dangerously overloaded, carrying a portion of the survivors from the Santa. The already suffocatingly cramped conditions have become almost unbearable. Men are packed shoulder to shoulder, with barely enough room to lie down. The meager rations of dried meat and strange native vegetables they have managed to gather must now be stretched even thinner, rationed out for a return voyage that will be even longer and more difficult than the journey out. The mood on board is not one of relief, but of deep, foreboding anxiety. The journey home is a new kind of nightmare. They're sailing against the prevailing winds and currents. Their progress agonizingly slow, and they are sailing into the teeth of the North Atlantic in the dead of winter. Soon, the warm turquoise waters of the Caribbean are a distant memory, placed by the cold, gray, and monstrous seas of the winter ocean. A storm finds them in the middle of February, and it is a storm of apocalyptic fury. For days, the world is a howling, chaotic vortex of wind and water. The sky turns a bruised greenish black, and the sea rises up in mountainous, white-capped waves that are taller than the ship's mast. The tiny caravel is tossed about like a child's toy, thrown up to the crest of a wave one moment, then plunging deep into the trough the next. The groaning of its timbers a constant, terrifying scream. The wind howls through the rigging with the sound of 1,000 tortured souls. Great solid sheets of freezing water crash over the deck, sweeping away anything that is not tied down and threatening to wash the men overboard into the churning, icy chaos. There is no rest. There is no shelter. Every man, including Columbus himself, works in a state of cold, wet, and terrified exhaustion. They are constantly at the pumps, their bodies moving in a desperate mechanical rhythm, trying to force the water that is pouring into the hold back into the sea. They cling to the rigging, their hands numb and raw, trying to manage the storm sails and winds that threaten to rip the mast from the ship. Pedro is no longer a sailor. He is a small, insignificant creature engaged in a personal, brutal war with the ocean itself. He does not think of Spain, or of gold, or of anything but the next wave, the next command, the next desperate fight to keep this small, fragile bubble of wood and air from being swallowed by the fury of the sea. They survive the storm, but they are broken. Ship is battered, its sails in tatters. The last of their food supplies have been ruined by the seawater that flooded the hold. The final, most desperate stage of their journey begins. The slow, grinding agony of true starvation. The last of the weevil-infested biscuits are gone. The men are reduced to chewing on scraps of leather, on the rats they managed to catch in the hold, on anything that can trick the stomach into feeling full. They collect the precious fresh rainwater that falls on the deck, but it is never enough. The specter of scurvy, which had been held at bay by the fresh food on the islands, returns with a vengeance, and the men, already weakened and exhausted, begin to succumb once more. Then, after weeks of this new hell, they see it. A faint, dark smudge on the horizon. Land. It is not the golden paradise of the Indies, but the rocky, storm-lashed coast of the Azores. The relief is so profound it is a physical pain. They have survived. They have crossed the great empty ocean and returned. After a brief, tense encounter with the Portuguese authorities on the islands, they set sail for the final leg of their journey. In March of 1493, more than 7 months after he departed, Pedro steps ashore once more in the port of Palos. He is a ghost. He's skeletal, his skin sallow and marked with the sores of scurvy, his eyes haunted by the things he has seen. He stumbles on the solid ground, his legs so accustomed to the rolling of the sea that they have forgotten how to walk on a world that holds still. He left as a naive, desperate boy. He returns as a man who has been to the edge of the world and the brink of his own soul. He hears the bells of the town ringing. He hears the people begin to cheer. He hears the officers begin to speak of a great discovery, of a triumph for the Spanish crown, of a new world. He sees Columbus, the man who led them through hell, being hailed as a hero.
But Pedro feels no triumph.
He feels only the deep, profound weariness of the survivor. He clutches the few small silver coins in his pouch, the wages for his suffering. He knows the true story of the voyage. He knows that the New World was not a paradise, but a place of new and terrible dangers. And he knows that the 39 men he left behind at La Navidad will likely never be seen again. He has survived. But a part of him will forever remain lost in that great, silent, and terrible wilderness of the sea. Our story is over. Pedro, the young sailor, has returned from the edge of the world. His pockets a little heavier with silver, his soul heavy with the memories of all he has endured. The great narrative of history will remember the names of the captains and the kings, the dates of the discoveries. But it is built upon the silent, forgotten suffering and the grim endurance of countless ordinary men like him. It is time to let his story fade, to let the sound of the wind and the waves recede into a gentle, calming murmur. Your own long voyage through the day is at its end. The shore is in sight. There is nothing left to do but to let go, to drop anchor and to allow the gentle, peaceful tide of sleep to pull you under.